The language analysis question on paper 3 is a challenging question to answer. And one thing that makes it challenging is text C, the engram, which you have to interpret and relate back to text A, the main text. So today I want to talk to you about how you can approach the engram in a way that's going to help you confidently reply to your question. Now, the first thing you need to know is that when it comes to analyzing the graph, your process is no different than analyzing the main text. You're looking for differences in the way language has been used over the course of time. So the engram is going to give you 2 to 3 words or phrases, then track the difference in their usage over time on the graph. So your first job is to look directly at those words and phrases and decide what is the difference between them. Is it a lexical difference? Is it a grammatical difference? Is it an orthographic difference? Is it a difference in spelling? So all these differences are going to dictate how you approach your response. So today we're going to look at an example of a lexical change and a grammatical change. Let's start with the lexical change. The steps for how you successfully analyze this graph are the same as the ones you would use for text A. So once you've identified the difference between the words or phrases on the graph, then you want to see if you can hypothesize an explanation for why that change has happened over time. At this point, you may be wanting to tie in theories or linguistic concepts from your greater or your wider knowledge of linguistics. After you've managed those things, the last step is to make sure you tie your findings back to text A. Okay, our first example has to do with lexical change. It's from a past paper where the text is titled "The Care of Truants and Incorrigibles." And this text was published probably in 1892. It's for the years 1891 to 1892, the school year. So we assume it's published at the end of that time. So I'm going to say 1892 is probably a safe bet. On this paper, we have this graph. And this graph gives us 2 words. One word is wayward and the other word is incorrigible. So the first thing I notice is that these 2 words are fairly synonymous. And the second thing I notice is they're not really in common usage today. Okay, so let's take a look at this graph and let's analyze the individual words. Both these words describe someone who has perhaps made some bad decisions. Describe someone who has demonstrated poor behavior. However, they're slightly different in some aspects. So let's take a look at them individually. Wayward literally means to turn away from. It describes someone who's a bit obstinate, who's set in their ways, and those ways being ways that are not approved of. Now, incorrigible is along the same lines, but it means someone who cannot be changed or reached. Someone so set in their poor behavior that nothing can intervene and change the way they act. So when I look at these 2 terms, even though basically they're the same, I feel like wayward is a bit more soft. You could probably reach a wayward person. Incorrigible is someone you couldn't possibly reach no matter what you tried. So our next step is to analyze our graph. When I look at a graph, I'm looking for trends over time. So where do we start? How do the lines move? And then where do we end? So looking at this graph, I see that my line starts with incorrigible being much more used than wayward, wayward being almost completely unused as of 1700. However, they converge together so that wayward becomes just as popular as incorrigible around sometime in 1830. These 2 terms sort of cross over. Now, the interesting thing here is that wayward does overtake incorrigible as a more popular word. However, both terms decline. And I don't think the story here is that wayward replaces incorrigible. In fact, both words stay in pretty close usage over the course of time. The trend that I notice after they intersect is that actually both terms continue to decline in usage up until 2000 at the end of the graph. So the story I'm seeing here is of 2 terms that become equally used and then sort of at a certain point, roughly around 1830, both kind of start falling out of general usage. The trend for incorrigible actually kind of is consistent. It starts high and slowly declines over time. The trend for wayward is slightly different. It starts low, peaks at a point of roughly around 1850, but then follows behind incorrigible and decreases as well. So what do we see here? We see two terms that have become equally used but then fall out of usage over time. Is there any way that we can explain this change, this trend? Well, if you have some historical knowledge, this is where that comes in handy. If you think about the way that we treat people who are accused of or convicted of breaking laws or disobeying rules, that attitude toward people who do that sort of behavior has changed over time. Over the past few hundred years, and especially in the last 100, we have drastically changed how we treat people who break the rules in Western society. Now, this probably has its beginnings in the Enlightenment and definitely sort of has culminated in all the prison and justice reforms we have had in the last century around the world, as well as things such as restorative justice that have become more popular in use. Today, labeling people, especially children, with these morally charged terms like wayward and incorrigible is just not seen as socially appropriate anymore. Those terms carry with them a sense of judgment on a person's character and essential being. And these days, we tend to take a more nuanced view of people who break the rules. So we may have respect in the way we talk about these people, respect for them as human beings, and also an understanding of how context and situation and a person's own special, unique circumstances play into their behavior. Now, this is something that's a bit modern. And so it does give us a good explanation as to why these terms may have fallen out of usage. Now, you may not know anything about the sort of trends in crime and punishment over the last few hundred years, but you probably can still figure out that this is a social change and why these words have fallen out of usage. And this is how you can tell. Think about if these words were to be used, if wayward or incorrigible was to be used to describe a student today, we would probably feel that that felt a bit inappropriate. And it would be for our current sensibilities. And that's how we know it's been a social change. Things that used to be appropriate, no longer appropriate. Or vice versa, maybe we have things that are appropriate now that did not used to be appropriate in the past. So this, I think we can use as a good sort of explanation for why our words fell out of popular usage. Now let's connect what we found here in our graph back to text A. Text A uses both terms, both wayward and incorrigible, and it uses incorrigible twice, once in the title of the text itself. But this makes sense when we look at where it falls on the graph. So this text is from 1882, we agreed. And that puts it right here. It's on the decline when incorrigible and wayward are still falling out of use. However, they're still fairly prominently used. They haven't fallen to their current low rate. So it does make sense that these would appear in our text. It just reflects the social sensibilities of the 1890s. When it comes to analyzing lexical change, especially in older texts, it really helps to have a wide-ranging vocabulary and a familiarity with terms from past centuries and the vocabulary of the past. Now, the best way to achieve that vocabulary and familiarity is simply to read texts that were published 100 or more years ago. Edgar Allan Poe, Frederick Douglass, Charlotte Bronte, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Anything published over 100 years ago, these are great ways to familiarize yourself with the language of the time and expand your vocabulary at the same time. Now let's move on to an n-gram that shows a grammatical change. So this is going to be from the text, which is an excerpt from an account from 1769 of a tour of the Highlands of Scotland by a writer named Thomas Pennant. All right, so this comes from 1769, and we're going to be looking at two phrases, has become and is become. So the first thing I will do is I want to look at and say, what are the difference between these two phrases? In order to do that, we're going to really have to heavily lean on our grammatical knowledge. What type of phrases are these? Has become and is become, I can tell you they are verb phrases. And just to verify that, we can look at how it's used in the text. In the text, the sentence reads, "This instrument is become scarce since the abolition of the power of the chieftains." Okay, this instrument is become scarce. The subject there is instrument, and then the verb phrase is become. So now that we know it's a verb phrase, we want to kind of figure out what tense it's in, and then what are the different verbs and what roles do they play within this phrase. So is become and have and has become, I can tell you those are in the present perfect tense. How do I know that? Well, I know that because the helping verb is in the present tense in both cases. So the first verb there, is and has, are both helping or auxiliary verbs. They come before the main verb, which is become. So if the helping verb is in the present tense, then your tense is going to be present. It's followed by the past participle, become, and the past participle is the same in both. So we have, when you have a present tense helping verb and then a past participle, then that's called the present perfect tense. So we have two verb phrases, both in the present perfect tense. The only difference between them is that one uses the auxiliary verb to be, and the other one uses the auxiliary verb to have. Now that we know the grammatical difference between the two phrases, we can go ahead and look at the trends over time. So starting in 1720, we see that has become is not really used much at all for the present perfect tense. However, is become is fairly widely used. The beginning of this graph, we see that these two trends converge, and where has become increases, is become decreases. What's interesting about this graph, as you probably noticed right away, is very symmetrical. If you draw a horizontal line through the graph, you'll notice that it kind of reflects itself on both sides. So as one line rises, the other line falls. And this is an inverse relationship. So we can assume that maybe there's some causation between as one rises, the other falls. It's not guaranteed, but let's keep that as part of our analysis for now. So around 1815, these two terms converge. Has become eclipses is become and becomes the more dominant term. After that, has become continues to increase, peaking, reaching about its maximum around a little after 1900, 1910, and at a similar time, is become seems to fall almost completely out of usage. Around 1920, it just doesn't get back up again. So we see a pretty straightforward story. Now, it looks like in this case, one term has replaced the other. The one term rises to prominence as the other term symmetrically falls into disuse. So now we come to the hard part. Why did this happen? What can we use to explain this? Well, when it comes to grammar, the challenge is sometimes there just isn't a good, clear explanation as to why language changes. However, we could reasonably hypothesize a few ideas. One possible hypothesis is to consider English's overall tendency over the centuries to simplify and become more consistent. For example, the language has simplified over time. The fact that we no longer use certain pronouns like thee or thou, or the verb ending eth, as in haveth or goeth. So we could extend that to say, well, perhaps this is another instance of simplifying or having the language become more consistent. Because in the other tenses, in the other perfect tenses, so if you think of future perfect and you think of past perfect, the helping verb is to have. So to have the helping verb or auxiliary verb be to be in the present perfect tense, it just adds a level of extra complexity, a different rule. If we make it more consistent to where to have is always used in the perfect tense, and then the verb to be is always used in the progressive tense. He is coming to school. So this change could be explained as a sort of trend toward consistency in the language. And this consistency is further pushed along by standardization. So as we know, Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1755, and this really accelerated this idea of standardization of language. Now let's connect text C back to text A. If we look at when text A was published in 1769, and if we plot that on our graph, we see that this makes our text fall right at the beginning of the trend we identified, where has become starts rising and overtakes is become. So it makes perfect sense that our author wrote, this instrument is become scarce, and that he didn't write, this instrument has become scarce. So what type of theories might fit these explanations? You might look at the graph itself and say, oh wow, the way that the lines trend is a good example of S-curve theory, wherein we see that language use remains fairly stable, increases or decreases fairly exponentially, and then levels off again. And what theories go well with our language change for Lexis? Well, usually when it comes to Lexis, you can't go wrong with Michael Holliday's functional theory. So the usefulness of the words societally or economically or having to do with technology, whatever the cause is, if the words become less useful, then they fall out of usage. If words become more useful to the speakers, then they increase in usage. And this would be a great way to talk about the graph here with wayward and incorrigible. I hope you found this video instructive and helpful. The language change question is a challenge, but with practice and with patience and especially with study, you can do well on it. So good luck.